September 1942, Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea. The air smelled like rot and rain. The jungle pressed in from every side, thick and dark and alive with noise. Somewhere out there, beyond the jagged black peaks of the Owen Stanley Mountains, an army was moving. And almost nobody in the Allied command knew just how close it had already come. This is the story the title promises. This is not a trick. Japanese soldiers, thousands of them, had done something every military expert said was flat out impossible. They had crossed the most savage mountain range on Earth, and by the time the men in charge finally understood what was happening, the enemy was already on the other side, already descending the southern slopes, already close enough to see the lights of Port Moresby glowing in the valley below. This story is about that moment, about the men who were supposed to stop it, about the boys who actually did. To understand why this mattered so much, you have to understand what Port Moresby meant in the autumn of 1942. It was the last major Allied base in the Southwest Pacific still standing. If it fell, there was nothing between Imperial Japan and the Australian mainland, nothing between Japanese bombers and the streets of Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne, the cities where these soldiers' mothers and sisters and children lived. The numbers made the danger plain. Japan already controlled a stretch of ocean and island territory more than 4,000 miles wide. They had sunk the British warships HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse in under 2 hours. They had taken Singapore, a fortress Britain called Impregnable, in just 7 days. They had swept through the Philippines, through Burma, through the Dutch East Indies, leaving wreckage wherever they went. Port Moresby was the last door, and it was barely locked. The experts said the door was safe. They said the Owen Stanley Range would protect it. The mountains rose to 13,000 feet, draped in thick, wet moss and jungle so dense the sun never touched the ground. The one track that crossed them, the Kokoda track, was not a road or even a proper path. It was a muddy, root-tangled scar that clawed up near vertical cliff faces, dropped into swamps that stank of decay, and wound through valleys where the rain fell so hard it felt like standing under a waterfall. Military planners looked at those mountains and said the same thing. No army could move through that, not at speed, not with weapons and supplies. It simply could not be done. The mountains, they said, were a natural wall. Port Moresby was safe behind them. They were wrong, and the proof was already climbing. Back in May 1942, Allied codebreakers had cracked a Japanese military message. The message said clearly that Japan's next move would be an overland push across the Owen Stanley Range. One senior codebreaker later called it one of the 3 most important messages decoded during the entire war. It was handed up the chain of command. It reached the desks of men with stars on their shoulders. And it was dismissed. The intelligence staff around General Douglas MacArthur decided the mountains made such a plan impossible. They filed the warning away. They moved on. The message gathered dust while Japanese engineers studied the Kokoda track and Japanese soldiers quietly began to prepare. General Douglas MacArthur was, at this point in the war, the most powerful Allied commander in the entire Pacific. He had escaped the fall of the Philippines in March 1942 by slipping away in the dark on a small patrol torpedo boat, a PT boat, with the sound of Japanese artillery following him across the water. He had promised the Filipino people he would return. He was now running the entire Southwest Pacific area, command from a building in Brisbane that had once been an insurance office. He had maps on the walls, staff officers in the halls, and complete confidence that the Owen Stanley Range would hold the Japanese at bay while he planned his next move. He was a man who did not easily admit that he had made a mistake. And in the spring and summer of 1942, he had made several. The protagonist of this story is not MacArthur. It is not any single general or officer or hero. The protagonist of this story is an entire nation, Australia, represented by its most unlikely soldiers. They were called the Chocos. In July 1942, the Papuan Infantry Battalion was joined by a wave of recent conscripts who arrived with little military training, whose average age was 18 and a half years old. These young men earned the nickname Chocos, short for chocolate soldiers, a term that was not a compliment. It meant they would melt under fire. They were militia boys, teenagers. Some of them had been in uniform for only a few weeks. The older, experienced soldiers, the veterans of the Australian Imperial Force who had fought General Erwin Rommel's tanks in the deserts of North Africa, looked at these kids and shook their heads. They were not ready, the veterans said. They were not real soldiers. They were boys playing at war. They were the first ones standing between Japan and Australia. On the 21st of July, 1942, Japanese forces came ashore near the villages of Gona and Buna on Papua's north coast. They did not come with trucks or artillery trains. They came light and fast, each soldier carrying a bag of rice and as much ammunition as his back could hold. 8,000 men hit the jungle and started climbing. The force sent to stop them was almost nothing. 4 platoons from the 39th Battalion of the Australian Army stood on the track as the Japanese advance guard came up through the trees. Not 4 companies, not 4 battalions, 4 platoons, roughly 150 men, give or take, facing thousands. They had no meaningful air support. They had 1 aircraft, a single transport plane that could land on the tiny Kokoda airstrip, and it could carry perhaps 30 men per trip. When Lieutenant Colonel William Owen flew in on the 24th of July to take command, he had almost nothing to work with. 2 days later, he was dead, shot through the head in the darkness while leaning over a weapon pit to check on his men. By the end of that same day, the Australians had been forced to give up Kokoda village itself. The men holding that crumbling line were teenagers with rotting boots and empty stomachs. The jungle was so thick that men 5 steps ahead disappeared completely. The mud sucked at every footfall. The rain never really stopped. Leeches worked into every fold of skin. Malaria was already moving through the ranks like a slow fire, burning men hollow from the inside. And still, the Japanese kept coming, regiment after regiment, pressing harder with every passing day. One young soldier, barely old enough to shave, looked up the track at the wall of green and grey mountain vanishing into the low clouds. Somewhere up there, past the highest ridges, past a place called Isurava, the enemy was already moving faster than anyone had thought possible. Nobody in Brisbane had yet truly understood what that meant. That understanding was coming, and when it arrived, it would carry 6 words that captured the full terror of the Pacific War in a single breath. The Japanese solution to the mountains was simple and brutal. Do not wait for roads, do not wait for trucks, do not wait for anything, just move. Every soldier carried his own food, his own ammunition, his own weight in iron and rice. 8,000 men threaded themselves into the jungle like a needle through dark cloth, and they climbed. They climbed in the rain. They climbed in the dark. They climbed through mud that came up to the knee, through tree roots as thick as a man's arm, through clouds so low and wet that soldiers could not see their own hands stretched out in front of them. They moved at a speed that defied everything the Allied planners had written on paper. And with every ridge they crossed, Port Moresby got closer. The Kokoda track was the cruelest kind of road. It was not really a road at all. It stretched for 96 kilometers from the north coast beaches up and over the Owen Stanley Range and down to the flatlands above Port Moresby. In those 96 kilometers, it climbed and dropped thousands of feet over and over again, like the jagged teeth of a saw. There were no gentle slopes. The track went up nearly straight and came down nearly straight. Soldiers who walked it described certain sections as climbing a ladder, hands and feet both, pulling yourself up roots and rocks while your lungs burned and your pack tried to drag you backwards off the mountain. The highest point of the track sat at 6,500 feet above sea level. Above that, the peaks of the Owen Stanley Range kept rising to 13,000 feet, wrapped in moss so thick and wet it felt like squeezing a soaked sponge with every step. The air smelled of mud and green rot and something else, something sweet and wrong, that men who had already seen battle instantly recognized as death. The Allies had one answer to this crisis, and it was almost embarrassingly small. One aircraft. That was the lifeline connecting Port Moresby to the men fighting in the mountains. A single transport plane that could land on the short, rough airstrip at Kokoda Village. It carried 30 men on a good flight, sometimes fewer. In the time it took to fly in 30 reinforcements, the Japanese had moved hundreds more men up the track. The mathematics were not just bad. They were a death sentence written in arithmetic. Lieutenant Colonel William Owen had flown in on July the 24th with orders to hold Kokoda. He looked at what he had and he made the only decision a soldier in that position could make. He dug in and waited. 2 days later, he was gone, killed in the dark by a Japanese bullet while checking his men's weapon pits. The Australians fell back from Kokoda the same night. The airstrip, that single, crucial lifeline, was now in Japanese hands. The Allied response at the command level was slow and confused. General MacArthur, still sitting in Brisbane, still believing that the Japanese advance would stall on its own, or that the landing at Guadalcanal would pull Japanese attention away from Papua, did not rush reinforcements with the urgency the situation demanded. He underestimated what he was dealing with. He had been underestimating it since May, when his staff had dismissed the decoded warning. Now the cost of that dismissal was being paid in the blood of teenage boys on a mountain that most Australians had never heard of. The man who would change what was possible on that track arrived at a village called Isurava in late August 1942. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor. He was a lawyer by training and a soldier by choice, and he had already fought in Greece, in Crete, and in the western desert of North Africa. He had seen desperate situations before. He had seen men at the edge of what the human body could endure. But what he found when he walked into Isurava stopped him cold. The 39th Battalion, those teenage chocos that everyone had written off, had been fighting and retreating and fighting again for weeks. They were not the soft boys their critics had imagined. They were hollow-eyed and gaunt, their uniforms rotting off their bodies in the constant wet, their boots falling apart, their bodies running on something that was no longer food or sleep, but something harder and quieter that did not have a clean name. Many had malaria burning in their blood. All of them were hungry. Some of them weighed 20 pounds, less than they had when they left Australia. And they were still standing. still holding a line that every reasonable military calculation said could not be held. Honor looked at his men and made a decision. They would hold Isurava, not because the numbers supported it, not because the terrain favored them, but because if they did not hold here, there was nothing behind them except Port Moresby and the sea. The 39th Battalion had roughly 500 men still fit enough to fight. The Japanese force pressing against them from the north numbered in the thousands, supported by mountain artillery, moving in coordinated waves, pushing hard with the confidence of soldiers who had not yet been stopped. The Australians had rifles, grenades, and knowledge of the ground. That was the whole list. The battle at Isurava lasted 4 days. 4 days of fighting so close and so savage that men used bayonets when the ammunition ran low. 4 days of holding a ridgeline while the jungle exploded in every direction. On the second day, a Japanese flanking force broke through the perimeter and threatened to cut the Australians off entirely. A young private named Bruce Kingsbury did not wait for orders. He picked up a Bren light machine gun, a weapon normally operated by a two-man team, and ran forward alone through open ground directly into the Japanese fire, clearing the position almost single-handedly before a Japanese sniper's bullet found him. He was 24 years old. He was later awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military honor the British Commonwealth can give. He never knew. The boys who watched him run and fall carried that image down the mountain with them, folded somewhere behind their eyes, and it never fully left. Help was finally coming, but it moved slowly against the mountain. The veterans of the 7th Division of the Australian Imperial Force, the AIF soldiers who had fought Rommel in the North African desert, men with the Libyan sand still in the creases of their kit, were being pushed up the Kokoda track toward the sound of the guns. The 21st Brigade moved into the mountains as the 39th Battalion stumbled back down to meet them. When the two groups passed each other on the narrow track, the veterans looked at the boys coming down and felt something shift inside them. These were not the chocos they had heard about. These were soldiers who had given everything they had and then reached down and found more. One veteran later wrote that he felt ashamed of the nickname they had all been using. It was not a word any of them used the same way after Isurava. The Japanese kept pushing. But something had quietly changed. The advance was slower now. Every ridge cost them more than the last. The track that had been their weapon was starting to become their trap. They were moving further and further from their supply base on the north coast, and the same jungle that had swallowed the Australians was beginning to swallow them too. Their rice bags were running low. Their boots were rotting in the wet just as the Australians had. The mountain did not check which flag you carried. It ate everyone the same, but nobody fully understood that yet. All anyone knew in those dark weeks of August 1942 was that the enemy was still coming, still descending the southern slopes, still getting closer, and in a building in Brisbane, a general who had not yet truly grasped what was happening on that track was about to receive the report that would change everything he thought he knew. The report arrived sometime in early September 1942. The numbers on it were not complicated. They did not need to be. The Japanese were 48 kilometers from Port Moresby. 48 kilometers, 30 miles. Close enough that Japanese soldiers standing on the southern ridges of the Owen Stanley Range could look down through the jungle canopy in the evening light and actually see the town. They could see the harbor. They could see the anti-aircraft guns. They could see the goal they had been climbing toward for 6 weeks. And Douglas MacArthur, sitting in his office in Brisbane in the building that had once sold insurance policies to ordinary Australians, read the numbers on the report, and the words came out of him quiet and flat and stunned, like air leaving a tire that had just been punctured. Good God, they're already there. 6 words, but they carried everything inside them. The shock, the disbelief, the weight of every dismissed warning, every wrong assumption, every week of underestimating what was happening on the other side of those mountains. The most powerful Allied general in the Pacific had been caught completely off guard by an enemy doing something everyone had told him was impossible. And the only reason Australia still had a chance was because a group of boys that nobody believed in had been standing in the mud and the rain, bleeding and sick and refusing to fall down for the past 6 weeks. The before and after picture of those 6 weeks was almost impossible to accept. In mid-July, the Japanese had been on the beaches of the North Coast, 96 kilometers away, with the full height of the Owen Stanley Range standing between them and their target. By early September, they were 30 miles from the city. They had pushed through terrain that Allied planners had classified as a natural barrier stronger than any man-made fortification. They had moved faster through jungle and mud and cloud than most armies move on prepared roads. By mid-August, General Tomitaro Hori, the Japanese commander on the track, had increased his force to roughly 8,000 combat soldiers, supported by 3,500 naval troops, all of them pressing down the southern slopes toward a prize that was now almost within reach. Port Moresby itself was not calm. The town had been bombed 78 times by the middle of August alone. The airstrips were cratered, patched, and cratered again. Fuel drums were stacked behind sandbag walls. Supply trucks ground through mud streets past buildings whose windows had been taped or boarded. The smell of the town in those weeks was aviation fuel and salt air and the particular kind of anxiety that settles into a place when the people living there understand, without anyone having to say it directly, that something very bad is coming. The soldiers defending the base looked at the mountains every morning and knew that somewhere up in that green wall of peaks, other men were fighting and dying to buy them one more day. Some of them could hear the distant echo of artillery rolling down through the valleys on quiet nights. MacArthur's response to the crisis was fast, and it was furious, and it was, in part, deeply unfair. He had disbelieved the warnings. He had dismissed the intelligence his own codebreakers had handed him in May. He had underestimated the Japanese, overestimated the natural protection of the mountains, and misjudged the speed at which the situation could collapse. Now he was looking at the consequences, but instead of sitting with that, he turned the heat outward. He made no secret of his view that the Australian troops were the problem. He told his commanders that the Australians lacked fighting spirit. He demanded that officers who had failed to stop the advance be removed from command immediately. He pushed General Thomas Blamey, the senior Australian Land Forces commander, to go to Port Moresby and deal with the situation personally. Blamey flew to Port Moresby and stood before the exhausted, malaria-ridden, half-starved survivors of the Kokoda fighting. These were men who had been living on starvation rations for weeks. Men who had been sleeping in the mud and the rain, fighting an enemy that outnumbered them 5 and 6 to 1, watching their friends die on ridges that had no names on any map. Men who had carried their wounded on their own backs through jungle so thick that stretcher bearers sometimes had to tilt the stretchers sideways just to fit between the trees. Men who had done all of this with falling apart boots and empty stomachs and bodies that were being hollowed out by tropical disease and had done it without breaking. And Blamey stood in front of them and delivered one of the most infamous speeches of the entire Pacific War. He told them they had run like rabbits. The anger that moved through the crowd in that moment was cold and very quiet. Not shame, just anger. The kind that settles into the chest and stays there. And as it turned out, that anger had somewhere to go. Because at almost exactly the same moment that Blamey was delivering his speech, the Japanese advance was grinding to a halt on the southern slopes of the Owen Stanley Range. The reason was brutal in its simplicity. They had outrun their own supply line. The same 96-kilometer track that had allowed them to move so quickly over the mountains had become a chain around their ankle. Every bullet, every bag of rice, every field dressing, every mortar round had to be hand-carried from the North Coast beaches, all the way over the range and down the southern slopes to the men on the front line. The men doing the carrying were just as exhausted as the men doing the fighting. The rice bags that soldiers had started with on the beaches were long empty. Japanese soldiers on the front line were now eating roots and bark and drinking from whatever muddy puddle they could find. They had the same tropical diseases rotting through their bodies that the Australians had, because the jungle gave its sicknesses to everyone with equal indifference. And then the order arrived from Tokyo. Guadalcanal to the east was now the priority. The Kokoda advance was to stop. General Hori was to withdraw his forces back over the mountains to the coastal beachhead at Buna and Gona. They turned around 30 miles from the city they could see with their own eyes. 30 miles from the end of the campaign. 30 miles from what would have been, in all likelihood, the end of Australia's ability to defend itself in the Pacific. Now Australia moved. This is the moment the title was built around. In the days that followed the Japanese withdrawal order, Australian forces covered roughly 80 miles of that murderous track in approximately 48 hours, not marching, not advancing in any clean military sense, but surging forward like a wave that had been held back for too long. These were men running on no food and borrowed strength, through the same mud and rain and dark that had been killing them for weeks. And they moved faster than anyone had moved on that track during the entire campaign. They moved faster, in some stretches, than the Japanese had moved going the other way. The experts who had said the mountains were impassable watched men who had already crossed them once, already been broken by them, turn around and cross them again at a dead run. MacArthur, receiving the reports in Brisbane, could only stare. The army he had doubted, commanded by the boys everyone had written off, had just done something that had no clean military explanation. They had done it on anger and nothing else. The Allied counterattack that followed was not a clean or triumphant thing. It was a grinding, gasping, relentless pursuit through the same nightmare terrain, in the same rain, through the same mud, past the same dead, still lying where they had fallen weeks before. The Australians moved north now, back up the track they had stumbled down, fighting pitched battles at every ridge where the Japanese chose to make a stand. And the Japanese did choose to stand. They did not surrender. They defended every position until they were killed, or until there was nothing left to defend. At a place called Templeton's Crossing, the fighting was savage and close, grenades rolling down muddy slopes, men shooting at shadows in the trees. At Eora Creek, the jungle absorbed the sound of the battle and gave nothing back, and soldiers later said that fighting in that place felt like fighting inside something alive. Through all of it, the advance and the retreat and the counterattack, the fuzzy, wuzzy angels moved without stopping. These were Papuan men, local carriers from the villages of the Owen Stanley region, who had been working alongside the Australians from the very beginning of the campaign. They carried supplies up the track and wounded soldiers back down. They carried men on stretchers through terrain where the path was so narrow and so steep that the stretcher had to be tilted sideways, handed over a cliff edge, lowered on a vine, tilted again, lifted again, a continuous, impossible negotiation between the human body and the mountain. They did this work without complaint, day after day, in conditions that were breaking professional soldiers. An Australian soldier named Bert Barros later wrote a verse about them, calling them angels, because of how they seemed to appear out of the jungle exactly when a man needed them most. They were never properly compensated for what they did. They were never properly thanked. History largely forgot them, the way history forgot so many of the people who made the difference on the Kokoda track. By mid-November 1942, Australian and American forces had pushed the Japanese all the way back to their coastal beachhead at Boonah and Gonah on the north coast. The mountains had been recrossed. The track had been walked twice in blood. But the fighting was not over. The beachhead battles that followed at Boonah, Gonah, and Sanananda were some of the worst fighting of the entire Pacific War. Fortified Japanese positions set into swamp and jungle, defended by soldiers who had been ordered to hold to the last man, and who did exactly that. Allied forces suffered casualty rates that shocked commanders on both sides. More than 600 Australians died in the Kokoda, fighting on the track itself. More than 1,600 were wounded. Over 4,000 were made sick by the jungle, by malaria, by dysentery, by scrub typhus, by the 100 quiet ways the tropics find to break a human body. Disease killed and incapacitated more men than enemy bullets. Every soldier who stood upright on that track in those months was doing so on borrowed strength. But Port Moresby never fell. The lights of the city that Japanese soldiers had seen from the ridge kept burning through the night. The door held, and the man who had whispered 6 stunned words into a quiet room in Brisbane was beginning, slowly, painfully, to understand what that meant, and what it would cost to finish the job. The war did not stop, and neither did MacArthur. Something had changed in him after September 1942. The shock of that report, the cold, humiliating moment of reading those numbers and understanding how badly he had miscalculated everything, did not leave him. It settled into his thinking like a splinter, small and persistent, working its way deeper over the months that followed. He had watched the Japanese do something impossible. He had been stunned by it, embarrassed by it, forced to reckon with it. And he had learned from it in the way that only a very serious defeat can teach. The lesson of Kokoda was not complicated, but it was hard. The jungle could not be conquered the way a European battlefield could be conquered. You could not line up tanks and roll forward. You could not build a railway and push supplies down it. The terrain swallowed conventional military thinking whole and gave nothing back. What worked, what the Japanese had proven worked, and what the boys of the 39th Battalion had proven in a different way by simply refusing to die, was stubbornness and surprise and the willingness to move where the enemy did not expect you. MacArthur had watched the Japanese use that principle to nearly take Port Moresby. By 1944, he had made it his own. On the 22nd of April, 1944, MacArthur sent an armada of 158 ships carrying elements of the United States 6th Army on a 400-mile leap forward along the northern coast of New Guinea, landing at Aitapi and at Hollandia simultaneously. He went around the Japanese strongpoints instead of through them. He landed behind their lines, cut their supply routes, and left entire Japanese armies stranded in the jungle with no way forward and no way back. The Japanese reaction was weak and disorganized. They had not expected the move. They were still thinking in straight lines, still expecting the enemy to come at them from the front. MacArthur had learned to come from the side, from the sea, from the air, from places the map said were too far away to matter. The student had absorbed the lesson of his enemy, and then gone further. The leap to Hollandia was followed by another and then another, each jump longer and bolder than the last. The island hopping campaign, bypassing Japanese strongholds, isolating them, letting them wither, became MacArthur's signature method and one of the most effective strategic approaches of the entire Pacific War. It saved tens of thousands of lives on both sides by avoiding the grinding frontal assaults that had characterized the early fighting. It was a strategy born, at least in part, from the lesson of a mountain in Papua New Guinea, from the lesson of what happens when you try to push straight through an immovable obstacle instead of going around it. And then on the 20th of October, 1944, a landing craft ground its ramp into the shallow water off the island of Leyte in the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur waded ashore through knee-deep surf, his sunglasses on, his corncob pipe clenched between his teeth, the cameras rolling. He walked to a microphone that had been set up on the beach, salt water dripping from his uniform, and he spoke the words he had promised 2.5 years earlier when he had fled the Philippines in the dark on a small patrol torpedo boat with the sound of Japanese artillery following him across the black water. People of the Philippines, I have returned. The photograph of him wading ashore became one of the most recognized images of the entire Second World War. It was printed on the front pages of newspapers in Sydney and London and New York and Washington. MacArthur looked like a man who had always known it would end exactly this way. He had the posture of certainty, the posture of a man who had never doubted. There was a morning in September 1942. Before the island hopping, before Leyte, before the photograph, when he had sat in a building that used to sell insurance and read 6 numbers on a sheet of paper and understood for the first time that he had been completely wrong. That morning, and the mountain that produced it, did not make it into the famous photograph. It rarely does with famous photographs. The boys of the 39th Battalion came home to Australia and largely disappeared into ordinary life. They went back to the towns and suburbs they had left as teenagers. They got jobs in factories and offices and farms. They married and had children and grew old in houses with small gardens. Some of them talked in later years about what they had done on the Kokoda track. Many of them never said a word about it to anyone for the rest of their lives, not to their wives, not to their children, not to anyone. The way soldiers often carry the heaviest things in complete silence, because the words for those things do not exist in ordinary language. The Victoria Cross that Private Bruce Kingsbury had earned by running across open ground into Japanese fire at Isurava was presented to his family after the war ended. He had been 24 years old when he died on that ridge. The medal was small and bronze and cross-shaped, and it weighed next to nothing. It could not explain what it had cost. It could not explain what anyone watching him run had felt. It could not explain the decades those watching men would spend seeing that run again in the dark before they fell asleep. The word Choco gradually faded out of the language of Australian soldiers after Kokoda. Nobody who had watched those boys come down the track in August 1942, hollow and wrecked and shaking, their uniforms in rags, their feet bleeding, their eyes carrying something that had not been in them when they went up, ever used the word again the same way. It had been meant as an insult. It had meant weakness. It came to mean something else entirely, something the English language does not have a single clean word for. Endurance, maybe, or the particular kind of courage that is not loud or dramatic, but just keeps putting one foot in front of the other, in the mud and the rain, when every reasonable argument says to stop. When stopping would be understandable, when stopping would be forgiven, and choosing not to stop anyway. The Kokoda track today is a trekking route. People fly into Port Moresby from Australia, hire local guides, buy expensive hiking boots, and walk the same 96 kilometers that the soldiers walked, over the same Owen Stanley peaks, through the same rain. They carry modern lightweight packs and satellite communication devices and freeze-dried meals. They do the walk in 8 to 10 days, and they come back describing it as the hardest physical challenge of their lives. The soldiers of 1942 did it faster. They did it carrying more weight. They did it eating less, often eating almost nothing. They did it fighting as they went. They did it in boots that dissolved off their feet. They did it with malaria in their blood and grief in their chest for the men they had just watched die. The jungle has grown back over the old weapon pits and fighting positions. The ridges at Isarava and Templeton's Crossing and Eora Creek are green and quiet now, thick with birdsong and the sound of rain on leaves. Small memorial plaques have been placed at some of the spots where men fell. Most of the spots where men fell have no plaques. The mountains do not remember anyone. They were there 100 million years before the war, and they will be there 100 million years after the last person who knew the name of any soldier who walked that track is gone. The jungle does not care about courage. It does not care about sacrifice. It grows over everything at exactly the same rate. But the story refuses to stay buried entirely. It comes back every generation or so because it contains something that people recognize even when they cannot name it. It is a story about the difference between what experts believe is possible and what ordinary people under extraordinary pressure actually do. It is a story about the gap between the map and the ground, about the gap between the general in the office and the boy on the ridge, about the thing that happens when you take someone that everyone has underestimated, someone who has been dismissed and insulted and told they are not enough, and you put them in front of the worst situation imaginable, and they hold. The chocolate soldiers did not save Port Moresby through genius. They did not save it through superior firepower or brilliant strategy or any of the things that end up in history books with clean, confident explanations. They saved it by refusing to stop existing in front of the enemy for just long enough that the tide could turn. That is the whole story. That is the whole lesson. They held the ridge in the dark, in the rain, outnumbered and sick and forgotten, because somebody had to and there was nobody else. This is the lesson that sits at the heart of Kokoda, and it is older than MacArthur and older than the Pacific War and older than the aeroplanes and machine guns and military maps. It is the lesson that history keeps returning to in one form or another whenever it reaches one of its hinge moments. Those narrow places where everything that comes after depends on what a small number of people do right now in the dark with what little they have. The answer at those moments is almost never the person everyone expected. It is almost never the decorated general or the proven veteran or the expert with the credentials. It is almost always someone nobody believed in. The Owen Stanley Mountains still stand. The Kokoda track still winds through the same jungle, the same mud, the same killing silence. On clear nights, you can still see the lights of Port Moresby from the high ridges, flickering in the valley below like they did in 1942, like they did when Japanese soldiers stood on those same ridges and looked down and thought they had almost won. And somewhere in that view, in the distance between the ridge and those lights, is the distance that the whole story lives in. The distance that 18-year-old boys held with rifles and willpower and nothing else. MacArthur got his photograph. He got his place in the history books. He got the parade and the microphone and the famous words on the beach at Leyte. He deserved some of it. He earned some of it. But the war in the Pacific turned, at its deepest hinge point, not in a grand headquarters and not in a famous battle, and not through the vision of any single great man. It turned on a narrow, root-tangled track in the rain, in the dark, on a mountain most people had never heard of. It turned because a group of boys who had been told all their lives that they were not enough decided, for 4 days at Isurava, and then for 6 weeks all the way down the mountain, and then for 80 miles back up it in 48 hours, that the people who had told them that were wrong. They were already there. They had been there all along. And history, if it is honest with itself, knows exactly who saved the lights of Port Moresby from going out. It was never the general in the building. It was the boy in the mud.